Chapter 4. Back at Ford's Theater, the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth almost ended before it began, when one man, an Army major, rose from his front row seat to pursue the assassin. The man, Joseph Stewart, long-legged at 6'5", decided to leap from the first row across the orchestra pit to the stage. In a few moments, he reached the stage and followed Booth into the wings. Stewart was the lone audience member who chased Booth. Booth continued rushing through the wings of the stage and down the passageway leading to the back door that opened to the alley. A few more seconds, and he would be in the saddle. The more immediate danger to Booth lay behind him. Stewart, following him down the passageway, was closing the distance between them with every stride. Booth hoped that Ned Spangler or John Peanut stood on the other side of that door, still holding the rented horse. He burst through the alley door, sucked his lungs full of fresh air, and slammed it shut behind him. Booth spotted his horse, standing quietly in the alley just a few steps away. He eyed the man reclining on the bench near Ford's back wall and commanded, "Give me my horse, boy!" Booth pulled himself up on the black-legged bay mare with a white star on her forehead and grabbed the reins. He balanced himself in the saddle. At that moment, Stewart swung open the theater door and saw Booth about to gallop away. Stewart reached for the reins, but Booth, an experienced rider, spurred and pulled the horse in a tight circle away from Stewart. Stewart tried for the reins again, but Booth broke free and kicked the horse hard. The horse galloped down the alley, vanishing from sight. Booth rode to F Street at the end of the alley. No one blocked his way. He entered the F Street and turned right. He had escaped Ford's Theater. Barely. Could he escape Washington, its streets filled with thousands of soldiers and loyal citizens, all there to celebrate the end of the Civil War? Booth rode past Herndon House, where just 2 hours ago he met with his gang and dreamed of this moment. As he continued east on F Street, he approached two of Washington's greatest landmarks. To the left, the huge marble patent office. Just weeks ago, it had been the scene of Lincoln's inaugural ball. To the right was the massive marble post office, where hours ago Henry Clay Ford had picked up the letter that he handed to Booth on the front steps of the theater. Gaslight bounced off the slick, polished walls of both buildings. Booth galloped past the buildings, out onto Pennsylvania Avenue. Few people saw him as he rode through the downtown Washington. That was understandable, however, because Booth rode away from the crowd celebrating on Pennsylvania Avenue. Booth crossed the Capitol grounds, racing under the shadow of the Great Dome. He galloped toward the Navy Yard Bridge that led out of the city and into Maryland. Could he reach the bridge and cross it before pursuers or news of the assassination caught up with him? Luck was with him that night. His hard riding kept him ahead of the news. As he approached the river, he slowed his horse to a trot. He saw guards ahead. Be natural, he thought. Don't arouse suspicion. Sergeant Silas T. Cobb was standing watch at the Washington side of the Navy Yard Bridge. He saw an approaching rider. He knew his orders. Allow no one to cross the bridge after dark. Cobb and the handful of men under his command prepared to challenge the rider. With a skill only an actor could manage under such stress, Booth prepared for a performance to talk his way across the bridge. The time was between 10:35 and 10:45 p.m. "Who goes there?" Cobb challenged. "A friend," the actor replied. Perhaps Cobb would recognize the star and wave him across with a smile? No such luck. "Where are you from?" "From the city," Booth replied. Cobb asked his destination. "I'm going down home, down in Charles County." The sergeant noticed that the horse was wet with sweat and had been ridden hard. Cobb continued to question Booth, asking if he knew that the bridge leaving Washington was closed at 9 p.m. Booth claimed he did not know. He claimed that he had started out of the city late so that the rising moon would light his way. Cobb reluctantly agreed to let Booth pass. This was a lucky break for the assassin. If Cobb refused to let the actor cross the bridge, Booth had no other way out of the city. He could not turn back. He had to cross the river now, at this spot, into Maryland. Open, isolated countryside waited for him on the other side of the bridge. He would be welcomed by friends. Armed with only a knife, he could not have fought the soldiers who blocked his way. Had Booth tried, the sergeant and his guards would have shot the actor out of the saddle, and the manhunt would have ended then and there, less than an hour after Booth had assassinated Abraham Lincoln. Once over the bridge, Booth turned to see if his henchmen, David Herold, Lewis Powell, or George Atzerodt, followed in the distance. This was their escape route, too. Booth saw no one, neither friends nor pursuers, behind him. From across the river, he saw a beautiful scene, a looming moon high over Washington, with the great dome glowing in the moonlight. He had done it, and he had escaped. Booth and Powell had left behind so much blood. Blood-soaked, Sergeant Robinson and Fanny Seward worked to save Secretary Seward's life. Robinson showed Fanny the best way to slow the flow of blood from the wounds with cloths and water. If they could stop the bleeding until a doctor arrived, he might live. Within minutes, messengers arrived with doctors who relieved Fanny and Sergeant Robinson. The doctors confirmed that, despite their hideous appearance, the wounds were not fatal. To his doctors, Seward looked ghastly pale, corpse-like, but he would live. One doctor treated the others Powell had so viciously attacked, Sergeant Robinson, Fanny, Augustus, and Frederick Seward. As the night wore on, Fanny feared that Powell might return, or other assassins might be lurking in the house. Disobeying her mother, Fanny prowled from room to room, searching for hidden assassins. Finding none, she returned to her father's bedside and sat with him. Weakly, Seward reassured his brave girl that she had done well this night. The Seward house grew quiet again. Everywhere she looked, Fanny saw signs of the horror that she and her family had just survived. She looked at herself, her hands, her arms, her long pretty dress, all drenched in blood. She could not stop screaming. The president's box at Ford's Theater was also drenched in blood. Mary Todd Lincoln stared at the president. He was still. His head hung low, his chin resting on his chest. She spoke to him, but he did not answer. Clara Harris saw Henry Rathbone, wild-eyed, staggering, and clutching his left arm with his right hand. He could not stop the flow of blood flooding over his hand. Booth's knife had penetrated deep. Clara tended her fiancé's wound. Down in the audience, more than 1,500 people went wild. Some climbed to the stage, asking the occupants of the president's box what had happened. Hundreds of people turned to friends, spouses, and strangers to ask, "Has the president been shot? Who was that man on stage? What was that knife? What did he say?" Half-crazed voices cried out, demanding vengeance. "Kill the murderer! Hang him! Shoot him! Cut his heart out! Catch him! Don't let him escape!" None of them realized that the assassin was already out the back door. The mood inside Ford's became dark, ugly, and menacing. Under the dim glow of the gaslights, people fled in a panic. The voices grew louder until nearly all 1,500 of them created an angry roar. This was a mob. Sitting just a few yards from the door to the president's box, Dr. Charles Leal jumped up from his seat. He made a direct run for the box, ignoring the aisles and jumping over chairs blocking his route. He struggled to get into the box through the door, which was barred by a piece of wood blocking it. Leal, not in his Union uniform, announced his rank and profession. Major Rathbone, standing between Leal and Lincoln, asked the doctor to treat him first, holding up his injured left arm to show his wounds. Leal looked into Rathbone's eyes, and when he determined that the major was in no immediate danger, rushed to the president's side. Dr. Leal introduced himself to Mary Todd Lincoln as a U.S. Army surgeon. He reassured her that he would do everything possible for her husband. As Mary wept, Leal began his examination of the president. Lincoln looked dead. His eyes were closed. He was unconscious. Leal, remembering Booth's bloody dagger and recalling Major Rathbone's severely bleeding wound, assumed that Lincoln had been stabbed. Leal called for a knife. He brought no surgeon's tools for a social night at the theater. If Lincoln had been stabbed, how could he stitch the wounds without needle and thread? Leal was handed a pocket knife. He cut open Lincoln's collar, shirt, and coat to examine him for knife wounds. There were none. Then Leal lifted the president's eyelids, studied the pupils, and understood the seriousness of the wound. It was a brain injury. Leal weaved his hands gently through Lincoln's hair, and as he worked them thoroughly around the head, discovered that the hair was matted with blood. Leal's fingers probed for the source of the blood and found it behind the left ear. A neat, round hole, about the diameter of a man's fingertip, clotted with a plug of coagulated blood. Leal's heart sank. He used his fingers to pull the blood clot from the bullet hole. That would relieve the pressure on Lincoln's brain. He dropped to his knees, straddled the president, opened his mouth, stuck 2 fingers down Lincoln's throat, and opened an airway. To draw life-sustaining oxygen into the lungs, Leal pressed Lincoln's chest and ordered 2 men to manipulate Lincoln's arms like levers on a water pump. He massaged the president's heart by pressing hard under the ribs. To everyone in the box, the situation seemed hopeless. Then the president's heart began to beat, and his lungs sucked in a breath. The heartbeat was weak, the breathing irregular, but Abraham Lincoln was still alive. Nevertheless, unless Dr. Leal could stabilize him immediately, Lincoln would die within a few minutes. Leal leaned forward and breathed air from his own lungs directly into Lincoln's mouth and nostrils. Lincoln's breathing improved. Leal paused, studied his patient's face for a moment, and placed his ear over Lincoln's chest. Amid the shrieks, moans, cries, and Mary Todd Lincoln's deep sobs, he listened. The doctor leaned back and saw the president's lungs filling on their own. Quick action had saved the president from immediate death on the floor of Ford's Theater. Still down on his knees, with all eyes fixed upon him, Dr. Leal announced his diagnosis and prediction. His wound is mortal. It is impossible for him to recover. Like Powell, on the night of April 14th, George Atzerodt was armed with a knife and pistol, a 6-shot revolver. His room at the Kirkwood House was 1 floor above Vice President Johnson's. Alone and unguarded, Johnson had gone to his room for the night. All Atzerodt had to do was knock on his door, and the moment Johnson opened it, plunge the knife into his chest or shoot him dead. Compared with the challenges that faced Booth and Powell, Atzerodt had the easiest job of all. But that night, Johnson escaped death. Atzerodt could not do it. He drank in the hotel lobby, and the more he drank, the worse the plan sounded. He did not knock on Andrew Johnson's door. He left the bar and walked out. Abandoning his mission, Atzerodt got on his horse and rode away. He wasn't sure what to do next. He was about to go on a rambling and error-filled escape journey. In the saddle, a few blocks from Ford's Theater, David Herold celebrated his escape from the Seward House disaster. He had gotten away just in time. No one in the house knew that Powell had an accomplice waiting in the wings. No one pursued him when he fled the scene, and no one in the Seward House saw or could identify him. He was safe for the moment. He was just another man on a horse on this night in Washington. He regretted abandoning his accomplice, but when he heard the screaming girl at the window, Herold decided to save himself. Following Booth's escape route, Herold headed toward Maryland. He approached the bridge at 11th Street. Sergeant Cobb and his guards did not want to let another man pass. Cobb challenged him and asked where he was going. Home, Herold answered. Cobb and Herold argued about whether he would be allowed to pass, in violation of the 9 p.m. curfew. Finally, without explanation, Sergeant Cobb waved Herold across the bridge. Somewhere east of the Capitol building, Lewis Powell was not having as easy a time as Booth and Herold in fleeing the city. He had escaped Seward's servant and the others, and no one was chasing him now, but he did not know the city well. It got worse. He somehow lost or abandoned his surest and quickest means of escape from the city, the one-eyed horse Booth had bought. As midnight approached on the night of April 14th, Lewis Powell was in trouble. He was a lone figure standing in the moonlight, lost, unarmed, and wearing a coat stained with blood. He did not know where he was, what to do, or where to go. For the next 2 nights, he slept in a tree. He began thinking of some of the places in Washington that Booth had taken him before. There was a boarding house, he recalled. He might be safe there, if he could just remember the address. 13 miles southeast of Washington, John Lloyd, the proprietor of Surratt's Tavern, went to bed. Although Mary Surratt had told him that afternoon to expect some nighttime callers, they had never shown up. Several miles farther south, on an isolated farm near Bryantown, Maryland, Dr. Samuel A. Mudd, his wife, and their 4 young children were also in bed. Abraham Lincoln slept too. More than 15 minutes after he was shot, he was still on the floor of the theater box at Ford's Theater. Dr. Leal could not leave Lincoln to die on the floor of a theater, a place of amusement. As Leal considered his next move, a woman rushed through Ford's theater to get to the president. She knew history was being made in the presidential box, and she had convinced herself that she must be part of it. Actress Laura Keene's knowledge of the theater's layout enabled her to bypass the audience and crowds that stood between her and Abraham Lincoln. Still wearing her costume and carrying a pitcher of water that would serve as her passport to the president's box, she made her way up a hidden staircase that took her to a private office near the box. In less than a minute, she had crossed the theater and emerged on the second floor of the same side as Lincoln's box. She talked her way to the door, through the vestibule, and into the box. No one thought to prevent the great Laura Keene from entering the box. The scene fascinated Laura Keene and stimulated her theatrical instincts. Hypnotized by the image of the fallen president, Keene imagined a scene with herself at the center of it. It was a once-in-a-lifetime chance, impossible for her to resist. Could she, the actress asked Dr. Leal, cradle the dying president's head in her lap? It was a shocking request, and of no possible physical comfort or medical benefit to Lincoln, but somehow Dr. Leal allowed it. So Laura Keene knelt beside Lincoln, lifted his head, and rested it in her lap. Bloodstains and tiny bits of gray matter from Lincoln's brain oozed out onto the cream-colored silk fabric, spreading and adding color to the frock's bright and festive red, yellow, and green and blue floral pattern. Laura Keene cherished the blood and brain-speckled dress she wore on this terrible night. In the days ahead, people begged her to see the dress, to handle it, and to marvel at the stains on it. The dress vanished long ago, but miraculously a few small pieces, 5 treasured swatches of it, have survived. Long ago the stains, once red, faded to a rust-colored pale brown. She is remembered now not for her talent as an accomplished actress or her lifetime of performances on stage, but for the scene she staged in the president's box. Other great actresses from 19th century American theater have faded into oblivion, while Laura Keene is remembered for a single unscripted act that took place over a few minutes in the box at Ford's Theater on April 14, 1865. The President of the United States could not die in a theater. Dr. Leal would see to it that Lincoln would die with dignity in a proper bed. "Take him to the White House," someone begged. "Impossible," Leal explained. Even the brief carriage ride between Ford's and the White House over unpaved, muddy streets, gouged with ruts and tracks from hundreds of carriage wheels, would be too much for Lincoln to endure. The bumpy ride would jostle the head wound and instantly kill him. Leal and the others in the box prepared to move Lincoln's body without knowing where they would take him, just knowing they must take him from that place. Laura Keene's presence in the box brought attention to an uncomfortable fact. She was an actress. This was a theater. And it was Good Friday, the most solemn day in the Christian calendar. But the President of the United States was not worshiping in a church. Instead, he was dying on the floor of a theater, a place of entertainment. Booth, now safely across the Navy Yard Bridge, rode into the dark. Of his 3 accomplices, he needed David Harold the most, more than Powell or Atzerodt. Booth was a creature of the city, and its fancy hotel lobbies, saloons, oyster bars, and gaslit shadows. He did not have the skills he would need to survive in the coming days, those of outdoorsman, hunter, or riverboatsman. But Harold was all of those things, and that's why Booth chose him, above all others, to be his guide. Once Booth crossed the river into Maryland, he rode through a darkened and quiet countryside. Few travelers were using the empty roads. He trotted over the route he had rehearsed the previous year in preparing for the kidnapping plot. As Booth rode on, he searched the horizon for Soper's Hill, the chosen meeting place with Harold. In daylight, it was simple to find the place, but nightfall had obscured the hills. Alone in the country, he was out of his element. Now Booth was more aware of the pain in his left leg. Near desperation after his hard ride, he glanced at the horizon. He was just beyond Washington city limits. David and the others might be a few minutes ahead or behind him. Booth saw nothing ahead of him. When he returned to look behind him, he heard a noise in the distance. Horses' hooves pounding the earth. Was it the first warning of a cavalry patrol in hot pursuit? As the noise grew louder, it sounded, to his relief, like one horse, not many. Then his pursuer came within sight, one small man on a gray horse. Relief trickled down the assassin's spine as he recognized David Herold. The actor was happy to be on safe ground, and now he had his guide. Maryland, although it did not secede from the Union and join the Confederacy at the start of the Civil War, remained a hotbed of secessionists. Maryland was as Confederate a state as could be without actually seceding. If Maryland had seceded and become the 12th star in the Confederate flag, the Union would have been in grave danger. The Union capital would have been completely surrounded by rebel states, isolated from the rest of the North. Booth and Herold spurred their horses, riding southeast to their first safe house a few miles away. Booth probably peppered Herold with questions. Why is he alone? Where's Lewis Powell? Did Powell kill Seward? Did Atzerodt murder the vice president? Herold would have answered that he had not seen Atzerodt since the conspirators parted earlier in the evening to carry out the 3 assassinations. He had no idea whether Vice President Johnson was dead. Herold told Booth the details he knew of what had happened at the Seward residence. The trick of claiming Powell was a messenger from a doctor had worked perfectly. Herold heard no gunshots. About 10 minutes after Powell entered the Seward mansion, a servant ran out of the front door into the street screaming murder, and then a girl threw open an upstairs window and started yelling too. This news seemed to prove to Booth the faithful Powell had carried out his mission, but Booth must have been unhappy with Herold for abandoning Powell, whom he especially liked, and Powell would have come in handy if he had to do any fighting during their escape. Booth guessed that Powell, who had never learned his way around the capital city, was a lost man. Booth certainly told Herold of his success at Ford's Theater. This was the assassin's first chance to describe his deed, and the actor in him probably made the most of the dramatic story. Outside Ford's Theater, bewildered pedestrians joined the crowd of theater patrons and hovered near the front doors awaiting the president. The public did not yet know whether Lincoln was still alive. Leal's team carried Lincoln through the lobby, out the doors, and across the steps where, just 11 hours earlier, John Wilkes Booth had sat reading his letter, calculating whether he would have time to put an assassination plan into action. The crowd gasped when they saw Lincoln being carried out of the theater. They swarmed and surrounded the president. Leal, the doctors, the soldiers cradling the dying president halted. Where should they take Lincoln? Leal scanned the street for a refuge. Straining his voice to be heard by a sword-bearing officer, he shouted a command. Take the president straight across the street and into the nearest house. A soldier crossed ahead, pounding on the door, demanding entry. In view of the horrified mob in the street, Dr. Leal pulled another blood clot from the hole in Lincoln's head to relieve the pressure on the brain and tossed the gooey mass into the street. Fresh blood and brain matter oozed through Leal's fingers. When Leal was halfway across the street, soldiers on the other side yelled that the house was locked and no one answered the door. The scene was incredible, impossible. Stranded in the middle of the muddy streets with no place to go, the President of the United States was dying in the presence of a mob of hundreds, perhaps 1,000 witnesses. Until this moment, no one had paid any attention to William Peterson's neat brick row house next door to the home that had been locked tight. It was a boarding house. Someone opened the front door of the house. A boarder had heard the shouting of the crowd and had gone outside to see what was happening. He stopped outside on the top staircase and raised a candle. "Bring him in here!" he shouted above the sea of people. "Bring him in here!" Lincoln had found a safe house at last. In a few moments, he reached the stage and followed Booth into the wings. Stewart was the lone audience member who chased Booth. Booth continued rushing through the wings of the stage and down the passageway leading to the back door that opened to the alley. A few more seconds, and he